Hi. Thanks so much for coming, and for some people that were at the last panel and are staying for more. Just to give a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to look retrospectively back at some of the experiences of the left in power that are called the pink tide, and I'll get into defining that. But just so I'm kind of looking back a little bit to understand some of the kind of crises in the region in the moment, and then other people I think will pick up and maybe look more at contemporary, things unfolding right now. Okay. For the first decade and a half of this millennium, Latin America was the only region of the world where leftist governments coexisted and contended with the social movements whose struggles had cracked open the hegemony of the Washington Consensus and opened up the possibility of radical transformations across state, economy, society, territory, and nature. These years, as proximate as they are, can seem quite distant today, an effect surely of the accelerating pace of political and economic upheavals across the globe, but also an effect of what some refer to as the retreat of the pink tide. So I think that these kind of heady moments seem distant now because we think this moment of Latin American leftism is kind of closed and it's history. If the pink tide seems to be in retreat, here in the belly of the beast, we are witnessing a renewal of socialist politics and of more militant movements. The combination of kind of the left seemingly in retreat, I'll problematize that a little bit, but anyway, the left seemingly in retreat in Latin America and a socialist renewal in the US makes for, I think, a really interesting moment to reflect on the experience of the pink tide. This is not at all to equate the context of North and South, or to say that lessons travel easily across the stark inequalities of our hemisphere. But it is to observe that the relationship between the left in power, so when we actually get into power, at whatever level that is, if that's electing people to city council or at a national level, the relationship between the left in power and the left in resistance, so by that I mean social movements that are not in power but contesting from the outside, is structured by a set of dilemmas that, while context-specific, evince certain family resemblances. When the left is in power, both governments and movements claim the mantle of representing the people and pursuing greater equality. As a result, the left in power, when the left actually makes it into office, is marked by a two-sided dilemma. First, from the position of governance, how do you occupy the state at the same time that you seek to transform it? This is the classic dilemma of actually using the state as a tool for transformation. Second, from the position of the left in resistance, so the social movements that are outside the state and remain in mobilization even as the left comes to power within the state, how do you protest the state when the government's avowed goals align with longstanding demands from below? Complicates the position of resistance to have the left in power. How do you discern between top-down co-optation and grassroots success, right? It actually becomes difficult to discern between those two. It's worth noting that the relationship between the left in power and the left in resistance never occurs in a vacuum. The inevitable reaction from the domestic right and from transnational capital imposes serious constraints on any leftist political project and complicates the strategies of left movements. This would be the case anywhere in the world, including in the US, right? So we would obviously, and have already seen, what the reaction of the right looks like when the left approaches the possibility of political power. But I would say in Latin America and the global South more broadly, this risk of an immediate and intense reaction from the right, and we're seeing the effects of that now, across the region, is more intense due to the neo-colonial patterns of domination that still very much structure relationships between the global South and global North, and in Latin America's case, the region's position on the economic peripheries of global capitalism and its position of economic dependency in fancier academic terms. In Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, Argentina, and elsewhere, pink tide governments, so by those I mean, just to define, first starting with Hugo Chávez's coming to power in 1999, and so onward from there, we had a period of many left-wing or self-identified left-wing governments coming to power. Pink tide governments inherited and intensified a model of accumulation based on the extraction and export of natural resources. I'm talking about, of course, oil and minerals and gas, but also soy and other kind of agricultural commodities. This model, the extractive model of development, enabled important forms of socioeconomic inclusion for the masses while simultaneously undermining more radical transformations. And it was ultimately a key factor in their demise and the resurgence of the right wing. Meanwhile, across Latin America, anti-extractive indigenous and environmental movements have had the inspiring capacity to stall or disrupt oil or mining projects at the local level, but have faced the challenge of assembling a broader popular sector coalition with the power to transform the extractive model. So I'm just flagging at the outset that the extractive model of development is riven with dilemmas for both the left in power, because it allows sort of forms of socioeconomic inclusion but undermines more radical transformation, and the left in resistance, because it does open space for localized movement to contest extraction, but makes it difficult to form broader coalitions. So that's kind of this two-sided dilemma. And more broadly, in a warming world riven by inequality, I think it's more vital than ever to understand the limits and achievements of both of these left approaches to extraction, both the sort of top-down kind of extractive model of the left in power and of anti-extractive resistance. So, for the Latin American left in power, oil and mining projects provided revenues to fund social spending and public infrastructure. As many people in the room are probably aware, between 2000 and 2014, there was a commodity boom that was a historically high prices for the very commodities that Latin American countries export and depend on economically. So in the context of this massive infusion of revenues, there were policies that used those revenues to provide for social spending and public infrastructure, which directly benefited the majority of the population and consolidated the political support of the economically precarious masses. And I think it's worth noting that it's safe to say, I think, and maybe this is a controversial statement, but I'll just say that without the commodity boom, I think several of those left governments may not have won re-election immediately. They had such an infusion of cash to work with to fund social programs that responded to the longstanding social debt, reversed austerity policies, and consolidated political support. So it's like a really important kind of coincidence of these two processes. Equally important, beyond the sort of material level, is also their ideological resonance, the ideological resonance of natural resources in Latin America. So there's a very long history that I think sometimes we forget about because of the proliferation of anti-extractive protests right now, which is I'm going to talk about, is super important. But there's a long tradition of demands, not per se against extraction, but to nationalize extraction, to democratize extraction, to have state ownership over oil and mining and gas, right? And so those demands existed from 1930s militant mining unions in Bolivia to more recently in Bolivia during the gas and water wars that was mentioned previously, against privatization of resources and for the people to sort of reclaim control over resource extraction. And those, they're also similar in Argentina and Venezuela and Ecuador, longstanding demands for the nationalization of resources. And so left governments were responding to those, right? They didn't invent this idea that we should use resources for social spending. They were kind of taking up demands that already had been articulated for the long durée of the 20th century by the popular sectors. However, and this is where the contradictions enter, it's precisely the goal of economic sovereignty that the extractive model renders elusive. Instead of making Latin America sovereign, it has actually implicated the region in new forms of dependency, especially via China's ascendancy, but also via the enduring infiltration or penetration, I should say, of North American capital. China has not displaced that; it's just like another actor, and has made them very vulnerable. These economies very vulnerable to the boom and bust cycle of commodity markets. And relevant to the theme of this pattern of neoliberal mutations, it's precisely in the extractive sectors that we see the most stark continuities, or the clearest continuities, between the neoliberal moment prior to the left in power, that we could say we're still in the neoliberal moment, but anyhow, the moment of neoliberal hegemony of Latin America in the 90s and early 2000s, and the post-neoliberal, quote-unquote, leftist governments, because those sectors of oil and gas and mining had already been deregulated, they'd already been penetrated by capital. What the governments did was not per se nationalize them in a classic sense, but just redistribute the revenues that came from them, right? But there's a lot of continuities in ownership and state-market relations from the neoliberal period. In addition to not generating or achieving anything like economic sovereignty for nations or for the region, the reliance on resource rents also undermined the core leftist goal of equality. In boom times, like the 14-year-long commodity boom, resource rents enable material benefits for the least well-off precisely because they do not require income redistribution, let alone expropriation, right? If you have rents coming in from oil and from mining, you don't need to take the property of the wealthy to give to the poor. You can kind of avoid some of the more intense questions of how do you expropriate assets. But by avoiding it, you don't confront the unequal kind of structures of society at the same time. So in an interesting way, and I'm kind of actually circling back to something Cedric said earlier about the sort of post-war Cold War moment in the US, echoing the post-war social democratic bargain in core capitalist states like the US and in Northern Europe, which itself was enabled by abundant, cheap energy, commodity export-led growth in Latin America was a positive, seemingly positive-sum game, right? You can boost the incomes of the poor without reducing the wealth of the rich, thus ensuring the political support of the former without provoking the reaction of the latter for a while until things start to get crisis-ridden with the commodity bust. And so when the bust happens, you have to slash revenues and you have to implement austerity. And basically across the board, every left-wing government, even those considered most radical, implemented austerity measures in 2014 when the price of commodities went down. And it's absolutely no coincidence that 2014 is the moment of inflection for the rise of the right. And I'm not making just a commodity determinist argument or a resource determinist argument, but it's such a key factor, right? You had all these left-wing governments suddenly without resources, and the right sees its opportunity to sort of come back into power and to attract some of even the popular sector bases of the left-wing governments. So in such a context, what are the opportunities and challenges to social mobilization from below? So I've been talking about the left in power, now I'm going to pivot to the left in resistance and how they deal with the dilemmas of an extractive model of development. In Latin America, scholars and activists have noted an escalation in conflict in response to mining, oil, and mega infrastructure projects. So Latin America, starting during the hegemonic neoliberal moment, continuing through the left, the pink tide, and now continuing under the right-wing governments, there's a proliferation of anti-extractive protests. It's one of the regions of the world where there's the most protests against energy projects, infrastructure projects, oil, mining, and to some extent, large-scale agriculture or agribusiness as well. It's also worth noting that in Latin America, these conflicts are the deadliest in the world. Many human rights groups have shown that it's in Latin America that anybody protesting a sort of extractive project runs the most risk of being killed by paramilitary, military, or kind of unknown forces, but who have the support of governments and corporations. So what these conflicts, the shape that these conflicts usually take is that a directly affected community, often but not always indigenous, so sometimes also mestizo or other peasant communities that may not be indigenous, but anyhow locally affected communities mobilize against firms and sometimes against the state itself for the state's role in promoting extraction. So why do so many communities protest extractive projects? It may seem like of course they protest them because extractive projects are bad, but actually we need to explain this kind of social scientifically because it's in the past decade and a half that we've seen this efflorescence of protest. And Latin America kind of, as I said, stands out in the world. So one reason is that there's this uneven territoriality of extraction, meaning that extraction of resources, especially non-renewable resources that have particular deposits in the world, oil or minerals or gas, though that means that it's particular places that are affected by the extractive process, right? So you get that sort of possibility for local protest because some people are affected more than others. But it's worth noting right away that geography isn't destiny, right? Not every single community protests extraction, and just being near an extractive project doesn't automatically mean that you will engage in protest. And I've found in my own research, but I'm also drawing on the research of many other scholars and Latin American scholars and activists, is that those communities that do protest tend to have prior experiences with popular organization, like they tend to have structures and organizations that facilitate them mobilizing against the extractive project that predate the project. And they also need to feel that whatever the oil or mining project is a threat to their livelihoods and to their identity, perhaps, right? Especially when we're talking about indigenous communities or other communities that have a sense of collective identity. So if it's seen as a threat and they have an organizing structure, then they'll probably protest against it, but all of those pieces kind of need to be in place. So under those specific conditions, local communities are very powerful geographic sites and collective protagonists of protests. Given their spatial proximity to a key node of the extractive model and of global capitalism more generally, they have the capacity to stall and disrupt projects. And when communities come together in broader alliances, such protests can potentially shape policies beyond the local level. So I'll just note a couple of recent examples in my own field work or in other kind of news items that I've read that there's a mine that I researched in Ecuador called the Quimsacocha mine, and in the southern Andean, the southern highland region. And for now, almost, for almost 8 years or 10 years maybe, there's been sustained protest against this mine project, and it just hasn't happened. Like, every year the community comes out, they protest it, they think of new tactics, it's incredibly creative, and there's also interesting rural-urban coalitions because the project affects the water system of a major city that's nearby. So through that sort of tactical creativity and sort of ongoing struggle, they have stalled this project, and it looks like it probably will never happen. So that's a major, I mean, think of like a set of, indigenous and mestizo and their urban sort of allies, communities, protesting against like basically foreign capital and preventing a project from happening. There was recently a really amazing lawsuit in Ecuador where the Guarani indigenous tribe was able to stall another oil exploration project. I've just been recently in Chile for the past 3 months studying the lithium extraction, which is fascinating and linked to the renewable energy transition, which I could get into. But the point is that just last week, a company pulled out of a project because of local resistance, right? So local resistance can make real gains in terms of stopping extractive capital in its tracks. But I also want to note, to complexify things a little bit, that an anti-extractive strategy that centers directly affected communities is also by its very nature a limited one. And I'm not saying this like I think they're limited. Their claims are limited because they are referring to their proximity to the project. They're sometimes making reference to their indigenous ethnicity, and so they're making their moral and political claims on the basis of a particularity, right? And even when they enter into coalitions, I think there's just limitations to aspects of that strategy. I think it's good at stopping extractive projects, but it has more trouble in terms of transforming the model of accumulation. For that, you need broader coalitions. This kind of anti-extractive approach has faced the challenge of assembling a more territorially diverse coalition. So not just those that are proximate to the extractive projects, but those in cities. And especially, I think the most difficult challenge is people that are, that in a way stand to benefit from resource extraction, right? So if you have social services directed at the poor and working class that are funded by oil revenues, how do you get those people in a coalition against oil? You can, and they're really, and we could talk about that more. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's the challenge of it, right? And I think the way you do it is one way is just showing how the extractive model of development ultimately does not benefit the poor and working class, right? It ultimately benefits like the people that own the extractive companies, but that takes kind of ongoing political work to sew together those alliances. So just to sort of close as my kind of last section here, I want to talk about something that's also a challenge in addition to building coalitions, which is identifying alternatives. Like, what would an alternative to an extractive model of development look like, especially in the peripheries of the global south, where that is just the way that those economies have been designed since colonialism, since imperialism. It's hard to get out of that. But including in the US, like, how do we leave behind a model of development that is rapaciously exploiting nature and causing climate change? And so I think these are questions for all of us to think about. So the way the pink tide governments approach this is they had this kind of contradictory stance that came out a lot in interviews that I did in Ecuador for my book, where they would say, we need to intensify extraction now to create the resource base to transition to a post-extractive economy. But it's like the transition never happened, right? It's like a constantly deferred thing. Like, I get the logic, but it becomes hard because it entraps you further in the extractive sort of logic of development. And with some exceptions, there was ultimately not that much progress in replacing resource rents with, let's say, taxing the rich, right? And that would be the difficult task and has been an ongoing difficult task in Latin America. But on the other hand, looking at what some of the activist proposals are, the anti-extractive activists, they tended to emphasize sort of projects such as ecotourism and organic agriculture, which I think are really important for local livelihoods, and I do not want to dismiss them, but they don't address the concerns, for example, of sort of the urban masses, right? So what do we do with the large majority of people that maybe, at least in the current way society is organized, can't engage in local agriculture, right? They need some other alternative for their material livelihood. So I think that's kind of the challenge on the resistance side. And I think kind of more broadly, those of us, and again, including everywhere in the world, including in the US, that are thinking about a post-extractive transition, how do we get out of an extractive capitalist economy, have to grapple with a really complex temporality of how transitions take place. So just to kind of get at one note of that complexity, thinking about how you divest from oil and mining projects that exist, implement moratoria on new projects, and simultaneously replace extractive revenues with taxes on the rich and reinvest existing rents into non-extractive sectors. So there's like multiple temporalities of how you transition, of how you dismantle something that exists and create something new at the same time. And as complex as that temporality is, the complex spatial scales of getting out of extractive capitalism. So as I've mentioned and tried to emphasize, local resistance to extractive projects is absolutely vital. It's a prerequisite for an alternative economy, and it mitigates the worst of climate chaos, right? We need to keep all coal and oil and everything in the ground if we're going to kind of avert the worst scenarios of climate change. So it's absolutely necessary to resist those, oil and mining projects at a local level. Such a transition, I think, can't be, and this kind of relates to something that was said in the prior panel, can't be thought about just in national terms, right? In order for a given Latin American economy to transition out of extractivism, there needs to be a sort of national, regional, and maybe even hemispheric set of processes that happen where we move away from an extraction energy infrastructure nexus in terms of the prevailing model of development and towards an economic model that prioritizes the needs of socio-natural reproduction and of caring for communities and our planet, and like centers social need and ecological kind of limitations in terms of, but that can't happen in one country, not only because there's a race to the bottom, but because where is the demand coming from, right? The demand is coming from the US, it's coming from China, so it involves kind of multi-scalar shifts. I want to just note that even as I'm pointing out some of the dilemmas and the complexities of extractivismo or of extractivism and of a post-extractive transition, I think that these concepts of extractivism and post-extractive transition are some of the most important contributions that Latin America has to like critical and left thought around the world. Like it's really in Latin America that these concepts of like what extractive capitalism looks like and how to resist it have kind of emerged, and I think that they offer a lot of food for thought for all of us, wherever we are in the world. But the urgency and complexity of such a transition brings us back to the thorny relationship between the left in power and the left in resistance, so that relationship that I started the talk with. Transformations at the level of public policy are unthinkable without a multi-scalar and muscular coalition of popular movements with the capacity and the leverage to disrupt the daily operations of extractive capital, and in its place, envision and struggle for new forms of North-South solidarity. Thank you.
My name is Jean Paulo, and I was trying to think of what to say, and I've been traveling back and forth to Brazil, writing about Brazil for some time now, and the context has changed very, very much. So every time I talk now, I feel like we also have some responsibility to share about the very worrying facts about things that are happening in Brazil at the moment. At the same time, we are in a left space, and Red May invites us to left thought that's utopian and emancipatory also. So somehow I wanted to invite us to, following up on Thea's intervention, first to kind of hold the paradox. Somehow, how can we think of some of the lessons of the pink tide while holding in mind the very real accomplishments and the very, very real and dangerous setbacks. And I will mostly talk about Brazil, but this is a continent-wide kind of context. First of all, anything that needs to be said about the pink tide, we always, as Thea said, I'll just repeat it, we have to keep in mind the very, very real accomplishments. The tens of millions of people who were poor, no longer poor, the tens of millions of people who were outside of the formal labor market or in the labor market, the millions of people who have access to education, who didn't, the types of issues that we talk about in Latin America today were unthinkable. Remember, these are conservative societies, and now people talk about LGBT issues, people talk about the rights of nature, people talk about indigenous issues and recognition, when if you had asked social scientists 15, 20 years ago, they would have said, this is not tractable, this is leftist pipe dreams, these societies can't have these kinds of conversations. And, of course, as I'd like to say, too, one of the things we take from this 15, 20, 25-year experiment in Latin America also are very real lessons about local-level democracy, about political parties, about rethinking and reinventing institutions. As Thea said, the pink tide was not someone winning presidential office. The pink tide evokes a kind of set of motions and movements that were prior. In almost every country, there are important examples of local social movements winning municipal administrations, winning state-level administrations, winning legislative offices, and doing very important things at those levels. That said, given all the impressive accomplishments, in the case of Brazil, the number of people who've stopped being poor is somewhere in the 44 million number. The number of college students has doubled over the 12 years of the Workers' Party. How is it, the question everyone is asking themselves, and activists and smarter people than I in Brazil asking themselves, how is it that the left somehow lost this war of ideas? When impeached President Dilma Rousseff came to New York, she told a bunch of stories about the coup that brought her down, and she said, we lost the war of ideas somehow. How did they lose the war of ideas, right? How did people who moved out of poverty, who benefited from these very real programs, whose material circumstances changed so radically, how is it that in that context a right-wing government can win, right? I think in the case of Brazil, so we have Lula coming into office in 2003, all these important accomplishments happening over his and then over Dilma Rousseff's first government. The World Bank calls this a golden decade of Brazil, this decade of social inclusion and growth, being, of course, as it was gambling on overcoming this resource extraction at some point, but people forgot to put that on the agenda. Things sort of come to a head in the 2013 protests in Brazil, which to many people on the left were a shocking scene. So basically in June 2003, very radical, very progressive young people were protesting a fare increase, a bus fare increase, and it's a zero fare movement. They were protesting it. The state level, the police, which is a state level competency, and so it's run under basically a militia at the governor's, serves at the governor's pleasure, was very, very violent. This caused most people to go on the street. There was some footage, and all of a sudden it becomes a very, very big movement, and then it spreads to city after city after city. Before you know it, the number of people and the kinds of protests and the sorts of banners you saw were very puzzling. All of a sudden, you saw people with Brazil flags, you saw people with very conservative, sometimes homophobic sort of things, you saw people talking about the feminists in the Workers' Party, people kind of anti-left discourse, and it seemed, someone used a phrase I like, which is a pressure cooker sort of exploded, and it was a huge mess all of a sudden. Brazil entered a political crisis that was had been, from the Workers' Party point of view, unexpected, right? Lula left office with 87% approval, which is one of the highest ever recorded for any democracy. Dilma Rousseff had been reelected. The economy hadn't quite yet slowed down, but for sure they thought they could bank on a decade and a half of real social improvement and real social inclusion and the millions of people who benefited. Somehow, what happened when they found themselves unable to respond, unable to give a convincing answer, somehow when the social movements that were the traditional base of the Workers' Party came out to defend the Union Central Cuchi, the National Students Union, the leftist movements, when they came out, they found themselves facing another subject, which were other social movements that had emerged that somehow were not connected to the politics of the Workers' Party. How did this happen? Somehow, the middle classes, we were talking about the importance of organizing middle-class people and organizing ordinary, non-leftist people to our political projects. Somehow, they had been feeling themselves left out of the socialist politics, and they came out. The elites jumped on the bandwagon, conservative religious activists and sort of like evangelist type people piled on, and all of a sudden you had a very, very strong anti-Workers' Party sentiment that led to Dilma Rousseff's coup and led to the unfortunate election of Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency. When we think back, and now a lot of people are doing this sort of reflection, how did they lose these bases? A phrase has emerged. Different people have claimed to own it. I like Olívio Dutra as the owner of this phrase, but certainly it might not be him. He was a former mayor of Porto Alegre, which was a kind of marquee leftist city under the Workers' Party. And he said, look, we had a government of inclusion, but not of transformation. We included people, but we did not engage in the sort of structural changes that we ourselves recognized as necessary for the social transformation. So, what were some of these things that they did not engage in? Brazil continues to have a media monopoly. The media is corporate-owned, very conservative. They fought very hard against the Workers' Party. They never engaged in a set of political reforms. Brazil has a very corruptible and corrupt political system. There have been all kinds of progressive ideas that would have involved kind of a frontal confrontation with elites. They didn't do. They never fought and they never tried to transform the extractive economy. Agribusiness did just fine under 12 years of the Workers' Party and continues to do fine. And I think for me, this sort of one of the Achilles heel of the whole story is that as the Workers' Party went from local to state to national, they abandoned one part of their strategy, one part of the Workers' Party recipe, as far as I'm concerned, which is enshrined in the 1999, now long abandoned program for the Democratic Socialist Revolution of Brazil, which was the transformation of institutions with the purpose of activating popular politics. Any of the cities that they won, where they ran successful governments, were ones that had meaningful participation, but where people were mobilized in large numbers to combat elite influences, right? These were a kind of populist experiment in which people came to meetings and made decisions, and they were activated to defend those popular interests. At the national level, the Workers' Party never did any of those kinds of experiments. There was a lot of participation under the national government, but there was no instance of mobilizing of these kinds of popular politics, and it became a party worried about winning re-election as opposed to activating politics, which had been what this party, a party where social movements could speak, was supposed to be about. Let me give you a couple of facts and figures. The number of workers in the formal sector increased significantly. The number of union strikes and union activity did not increase. The number of college students doubled over this 12-year period. The number of students involved in the student movement didn't increase. The number of homeowners increased, but the number of neighborhood associations never did. And perhaps in what was the thing they most regret, they abandoned a kind of popular organizing. The Workers' Party comes from liberation theology, popular education, base organizing. And essentially, when it became a party in power, talk about party in power and party in opposition, they abandoned that terrain. And evangelists, religious conservatives, others went to occupy that. If you go to poor urban areas in Brazil today, you will see in any sort of favela area 8 or 9 evangelical churches, but you will not see an ecclesiastic-based community. You will not see a Workers' Party organization, right? They abandoned that terrain and others occupied it. So just to close, and I will close on a sort of a worrying note. The problem with Jair Bolsonaro, so I have a piece coming out this next week where we are guessing he will not stay in power very long. We think his coalition is going to engulf him. He's essentially incompetent. He has a crazy set of advisors. His party is ridiculous. And his approval rating is going down. But the problem with him is that he represents an authoritarian, anti-democratic politics. It's not so much that he is a rightist and he wants to undo our policy of social inclusion. He wants to undo democracy itself. He wants to abolish councils where people have the right to participate. He has essentially stopped recognizing indigenous rights as a legitimate interlocutor in democracy. He constantly speaks of enemies instead of talking about social movements and opponents. He regularly takes to Twitter to attack specific academics who then have to flee the country. And the country, which was an unbelievably violent country before he got elected, has actually become more violent. The latest figures in Rio show this is the highest number of homicides at the hand of the police ever recorded. It's close to 200 a month in the city of Rio, which is an absurd number for a country that's not at war. And this is the kind of thing that we worry about, is that he's moving the country to the right, and he's undoing very real things that will be very difficult for people to build up again. Sorry, I don't have better news.
Thanks, everyone. So we are actually shifting. I will speak now about Puerto Rico. So in February 2018, in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, Governor Ricardo Rosselló announced that Puerto Rico is open for business. The aspiration for rebuilding Puerto Rico, he added, is to be a blank canvas for innovation. So, as you may know, Puerto Rico, an unincorporated territory of the United States, currently has $74 billion of bond debt and $49 billion of unfunded pension obligations. Puerto Rico's $123 billion debt is the largest municipal debt in United States history. In May 2017, if you recall, Puerto Rico filed for bankruptcy under Title III of Promesa. Is this better? Okay, so in May 2017, Puerto Rico filed for bankruptcy under Title III of Promesa, a 2016 federal law that installed a fiscal control board tasked with achieving fiscal responsibility and access to capital markets. Austerity, privatization, and other modes of dispossession are key to the board's efforts to ensure that creditors are paid and hence that Puerto Rico's good standing is regained. Debt restructuring generates a parallel government of lawyers, consultants, firms. 2 main restructuring deals have been reached, those of Cofina and Perra. On September 20, 2017, as you may recall, a Category 4, it was a Category 5, but when it actually hit land, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico. Debilitated by Hurricanes Irma 2 weeks prior, Puerto Rico's infrastructure collapsed. The electrical grid, water distribution and filtration systems, telecommunications networks were severely compromised. 11 months after Maria, the last family without electricity regained service, and it's still coming on and off. Today, 30,000 homes remain with FEMA blue tarps as roofs. Many FEMA and insurance claims remain outstanding, giving misinformation, language barriers, lack of property titles, and lack of property titles recognized by federal law. As you may know, federal response to Hurricane Maria was plagued by mismanagement, inefficiency, and abandonment. The Jones Act, which regulates maritime commerce, was suspended for only 10 days, hindering relief efforts considerably. It is estimated that 4,645 people died as a result of the hurricane, far exceeding the official death count raised from 64 to 1,427 in August of 2018. Around 200,000 individuals left the archipelago in the wake of Maria. The last tally is 130,000 that have not returned. The President of the United States hurled paper towels at a crowd of survivors, purportedly gesturing aid distribution, and stated that the U.S. budget was thrown out of whack by the devastation. The debt has yet to be audited, and the debt have yet to be properly counted. Lacking an account, Puerto Rico becomes a blank canvas for innovation. The capture of land, the sea, natural resources, indeed the disarticulation of community, of modalities of being in common, of life itself in light of the aims of capitalism and colonialism is not new. Rosselló's call for foreign investment is not new either. Foreign investment through tax exemption has been the pillar of economic development in the unincorporated territories since at least the 1920s. An economic program that turns the archipelago into a mere site of the capture of value is distinctive of the intersection of colonialism and capitalism in Puerto Rico. Debt, I want to argue, should be understood as an apparatus of capture and predation, but also one that functions as a form of coloniality. The concept of coloniality names the afterlives of the colonial project of capitalist modernity in post-colonial contexts. It clarifies race, gender, class hierarchies installed by this project, but that continue re-articulated in different historical and material conditions. In the case of Puerto Rico, colonialism and coloniality intersect. Reflection on the case of Puerto Rico requires tracking the reproduction of coloniality in the colony, since we're not in a post-colonial context, from the colony. The intersection of colonialism and coloniality varies given the operations of capital. The colony, as Ariana Godreau writes, is what happens in repeated acts of capture. Indebted life is the continuation of the colonial life. The juridical political status of unincorporation, which establishes us as the most straightforward colony, is one side of the reproduction of race, gender, class hierarchies distinctive of coloniality. The status question, or unincorporation, is the basis for understanding the distinctive form of colonial exceptionality expressed in the case of Puerto Rico under U.S. colonial rule. But exceptionality is not a matter of declarations of fiscal or natural disaster emergency for the administration of the colony, as the institution of a fiscal control board or measures in response to Hurricane Maria would have it. I think the latter become focal points for capture, but they build on structures already operating extensively. So, exceptionality is a matter of the ways in which the strictures of economic and political liminality distinctive of unincorporation sustains the intersection of colonialism and coloniality. The latter intersects at points identified by the aims of capital. I want to say that financial debts index historical debts. In the case of Puerto Rico, financial debts index colonial debts. The claim is not that financial debts are the legacy of colonial debts, but in fact that they are the continuation of a colonial project, rearticulated in light of the strictures of neoliberalism in a post-financial crisis context. Understanding financial debts as historical debts illuminates the race, gender, class hierarchies that are the legacy of colonialism, but that remain at the work of an ongoing coloniality. Race, gender, class hierarchies are a matter of marking subjects and populations as dispensable through an ongoing expropriation, dispossession, exploitation, and expulsion. The work of designating culpability is particularly important since it functions as a mode of legitimating injunctions to pay. The entrepreneurs that seek to rebuild, supposedly, Puerto Rico, reaping the benefits of tax haven conditions, so like cryptocurrency and blockchain technology investors that have, that's just one example, that have moved to Puerto Rico to reap these benefits. They reflect a version of neoliberal subjectivity bound only to the strictures of innovation, self-reliance, and self-responsibility. This expression of neoliberal subjectivity has incorporated the language of community, indeed the common, solidarity, sustainability. The disarticulation of local community or the environmental impacts are folded into the purported benefits of innovation, horizontality, and global citizenship. This version of neoliberal subjectivity is the other side of the same coin of subjectivation and post-financial crisis articulations of neoliberalism. Forms of subjectivation within debt crisis draw from the value of personal responsibility at the heart of neoliberal ideology, yet they address the regressive features of debt. Unpayable debt is the failure of a self as enterprise. Indebted subjects and populations fail to capitalize on their own investments as human capital. The point is that they're culpable, and as culpable, they are summoned to pay the debts of capital through austerity, expropriation, and expulsion. Ariadna Godrobert has proposed a pedagogy of the indebted woman to track the relation between debt, austerity, and coloniality in Puerto Rico. The cartography of debt that a pedagogy of the indebted woman makes possible maps the production of objection central to the work of neoliberal coloniality and the installation of race-gender hierarchies that are the continuation of the colonial condition. Debt not only binds the failed neoliberal subject to the fate of capital, debt binds the colonized to an economy of exploitation, control, but also poverty and neglect. Debt deepens the production of a surplus population, not merely a failed economic subject. As failed economic subjects, as well as mere unproductive bodies and populations are deemed culpable, hence responsible for repaying the debt. Debts bind differentially, however, along race, gender, class lines. It produces those lines of demarcations, in fact. The cartography of debt not only locates, ubica, racialized gendered bodies and populations in the no place of debt, it tracks the location by mapping the productivity of coloniality, that is to say, the production of race, gender, class hierarchies. As an injunction to pay, austerity is central to that production. Austerity continues the colonial condition. It captures by continuing the colonial condition. Godrobert centers the indebted woman, specifically cis and trans Black and brown women in the archipelago, most impacted by austerity. Women have always been made to assume the cost of social reproduction, yet they must now assume the weight of economic, social, political, and environmental collapse. Austerity makes this clear. Women are at the same time not counted on in terms of the decisions regarding budget cuts that impact every aspect of her life, and counted on to assume the gaps in care, labor, whether physical or emotional, time, resources, her body, material needs, generated by those cuts. A cartography of debt tracks the failures announced in the body of the indebted woman then. It tracks the positing of the culpable subject of debt as a racialized body of women who bear the burden of economic collapse. Debt captures then by heightening exemptions and augmenting blame. Payment is not its end. It generates precarity, identifying it as economic opportunities. But it therefore leaves a trace, revealing more than financial operations. So to see financial debts as indexing historical debts, indeed indexing colonial debts, is to see debt as a site of reckoning. And so this is, I'm going to turn now to the what to do type of question by not providing an analysis of what to do, but thinking a little bit about some of the political interventions that I see are quite promising and interesting in Puerto Rico today. So financial debts admit of an exposition of the material history of the debt itself. Any legitimate debt admits of an audit, and also illegitimate debt admits of an audit, is subject to accounting, to account giving. Financial debts are also a site of reckoning given the reversibility of the injunction to pay, however. So debts are reversible, not merely cancelable. Debt is not reversible because it can return us to a previous state of affairs. It is reversible because it is possible to invert the positions it generates, the power it exercises. The deferral, the diversion that debt produces in order to exercise its power can open a time and a space of reckoning, of giving accounts and holding accountable. Minimally, an audit, a citizen debt audit, establishes whether a debt is illegitimate, illegal, or odious. It does so for the sake of cancellation. Such intervention interrupts the operation of debt. It interrupts the necropolitical effects of debt, the impacts of austerity on already precarious populations given their position in a raised gender hierarchy articulated by capital. An audit would point out the agents of capital by their first and last names, including banks, law firms, politicians. Their decisions nourish some while strip the others of the body itself. An audit would moreover shed light on the political economy that makes interventions by these agents of capital possible in the first place. But debt admits of much more. It makes possible giving accounts, holding accountable, reversing who is creditor and who is debtor, who is the one who has to pay. The reversibility of debt enables subversive interruption. When activists in the archipelago demand that the guilty pay, that they owe us, that it is time to pay, they locate themselves within debt to subvert it. It is a taking of, una toma, of the normativities of the debt itself, moving from an economic to historical debts, which is to say to colonial debts. They challenge the perception of the indebted as neutralized, without power, merely bound to economic, historical, colonial debts. They not only invert who is creditor and who is debtor, they affirm dismantling the political economy that sustains the colonial condition and coloniality. They invite us to dismantle race, gender, class hierarchies in their multiplicities, intensities, differences. They thus go beyond cancellation, recognizing, of course, its urgency. Subverting debt requires seizing structures of collection, as Ariana Godreau puts it. We can distinguish between the logic of collection of capital or the colony and the logic of payment. The logic of collection captures the body, time, coasts, bonds with another, value in all senses. It reproduces punishment, the production of an abject, bankrupt, indebted subject that has to pay through austerity, dispossession, expulsion. It domesticates debt itself by directing it towards credit, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney would say. It settles in order to regain access to financial markets. Debts that settle in order to generate more credit reinstall structures of collection, initiating new logics of persecution. In contrast, the logic of payment places us in a material history. It invites us to turn the deferral, the diversion of debt itself into a time for and a space of account giving, of economic, historical, and colonial rendir cuentas, giving an account. So Godreau says that regarding capital and its logic of collection, we do not owe ourselves to anyone. Nosotras no nos debemos a nadie. As we have heard on the streets, that debt is not going to be paid. Esa deuda no la vamos a pagar. The logic of payment is an act of power from disempowerment, as Janet Royman would say. It exploits the diversion of financial debts installed in order to capturing debt itself. They do this by placing financial debts in a material or colonial history. They exploit repayment to interrupt coloniality, to turn it inoperative. The non-payment of the debts of capital thus requires dismantling the structures that reproduce coloniality and not only the colony. Giving accounts, holding accountable also requires navigating one's location within that very race, gender, class hierarchy that complicates complicity with the aims of interruption. The logic of payment collects then, but it does so in order to interrupt the continuation of the colonial condition. If a political economy that reproduces the colonial condition is left intact, that is to say, if the race, gender, class hierarchies that it installs or deepens are left intact, the subversion of debt has been neutralized. Here we find, or we see the power of the audit, cancellation, non-payment, among other efforts in the archipelago that challenge the legitimacy of debt. These are time spaces of confrontation with colonial debts. Thank you. So Veronica wants to make a clarification that we should, thinking about the previous panelists, that we should approach the critics of the prior moment in Latin America by framing it first and foremost in a moment of repudiation for what is happening in Venezuela, and for the turn to the right and neo-fascism in the region.
Well, my perspective has to do on how we think in a specific relation to the crisis. I think that the crisis is a privileged locus for thinking because there is a cognitive porosity. When concepts are set in motion and sensibilities express the commotion and reorganize the limits of what is considered possible and how it is expressed. Today in Argentina, but I think in all our region, the meaning of the current crisis itself is in dispute. I'm interested in thinking against the idea that neoliberalism is able to eliminate all types of antagonism because it is successful in producing what life is in terms of capital. Instead, I want to think about what forms of antagonism are today deploying and what forms antagonism takes in neoliberalism. That also means asking what forms antagonism takes against neoliberalism. I think that to situate neoliberalism from Latin America, we have to start with the dictatorships that came to power to replace a cycle of worker, neighborhood, and student struggles. So the beginning of neoliberalism is inseparable from the violence against and intensified class struggles in the 70s. In Argentina in particular, neoliberal structural reforms were initiated during the last military dictatorship with the state and paramilitary repression of working class organization and popular and armed insurgency. Paradigmatic reforms such as the 1977 Financial Institutions Law that is still valid must be included in this genealogy. The entire period of the Washington Consensus was our democratic transition, ruled by the main parties. More recently, we must think about the revolts and the beginning of the century against neoliberalism also in genealogical terms, to ground the critique of neoliberalism as a mode of power, dispossession, and subjectivation. The crisis of 2001 in Argentina, that is related to a continental sequence of uprisings against neoliberalism, implied a mutation in neoliberalism because it was the first massive response after the dictatorship. The 2001 crisis set up the beginning of the post-dictatorship. So I think that we have to focus on the terrain of resistance subjectivities associated with social movements and led to the crisis of the neoliberal agenda across the continent in the beginning of the century. I propose that this understanding can be developed from a perspective that highlights the emergence and mutations of neoliberalism as a response to specific struggles. So the veto power, el poder de veto, as Raquel Gutiérrez called it, of social movement, produce a political force in the crisis. Those revolts open up new territories of resistance and production that took up the crisis of social inclusion through the way and politicized the figures of exclusion and bare life to conceptualize the social. The cycle of the so-called progressive governments is unthinkable without those crises from below that caused the subsequent turn of the region's governments. And this forces us to think about how we can detect neoliberalism's persistence beyond its crisis of political legitimacy, looking at how it becomes rooted in popular subjectivities, resulting in what I call neoliberalism from below. That also means researching how antagonism is reformulated in a moment that from the point of view of the government was presented at the end of neoliberalism. That implied and still implies reading the social as a simple instance of demands to satisfy, repair, and amend, reducing those collective dynamics to a passive position, denying their immediately productive condition and infantilizing them as pre-political, as non-civil status. This perspective that I want to deploy implies temporalizing, that is, creating a new rhythm and temporality from within the struggles. This means, again, thinking against those perspectives that only focus on the level of governments without considering the plurality of dimensions in which continuities and discontinuities of neoliberalism are both at play, referring to deeper logics than those referenced by the political system. But what kind of struggles did we see after neoliberalism crisis of political legitimacy? I think that struggles that combine antagonism and ambivalence, that is the materiality of what I refer to as neoliberalism from below. So, antagonism emerges when relations of domination and exploitation are altered, opening up new forms of political decision-making about the commonwealth. But at the same time, this dispute is one that is not pure anti-capitalist abstract schema, rather a practical experimentation of building autonomy as a political force. Then, speaking of neoliberalism from below, is a way of accounting for the dynamic that resists exploitation and dispossession, and at the same time takes on and unfolds in this anthropological space of calculation, which is in turn the foundation for an intensification of that exploitation and dispossession. So, struggles within and against neoliberalism are struggles against dispossession and against the financial apparatuses as a private solution to those dispossessions, as new forms of extraction of value. But this also implies negotiating with the state, with the compulsive bancarization of the state, and with new forms of violence that exist in those territories. The forms of resistance to neoliberal governmentality that appear in this pluralization demonstrate, depending on whether it is a moment of stability or crisis, the governmentality's precarious phase. Above all, these practices reveal the heterogeneous, contingent, and ambiguous nature of the dispute between obedience and autonomy in the interpretation and appropriation of neoliberal conditions. So, what does the populist perspective avoid thinking about and problematizing? First of all, I want to explain that my critique of populism associated with the cycle of the progressive governments in Latin America has nothing to do with an accusation of irrationality or that associates populism with the manipulation of political passions or populism as not democratic. All those critiques have usually come from the right. My critique, on the contrary, is directed to its rationality, condensed in progressive governments in the region, based on the expropriation of the political surplus that is produced from below. How? First, when the social is characterized as pre-political, as I mentioned before, as a pre-political space which is always incomplete and needs political representation, orientation, and articulation, that denies the forms of the political elaborated from below. In this sense, it supposes the image of an omnipotent above for the state. This is primarily nostalgic, but also unrestricted reading of the present, where state action itself must adjust to a dynamic of governmentality. The populist perspective recreates the binary of the state versus the market, which is at the heart of the politicism that I think we have to debate, that celebrated the so-called return of the state as a synonym of the end of neoliberalism. In addition, in this politicist schema, the popular, on being a concrete and motley complexity, displaces as a strictly rhetorical figure. Only then can it be invoked to legitimate a power that repairs and unifies that which otherwise is condemned for spontaneity and multitudinous disorder. My hypothesis is that even when populism presents itself as neo-developmentalism, evokes an industrialist imaginary. Today, its capacity for deployment is directly tied to the hegemony of rent. This assumes and is based on a decisive mutation in social inclusion. It is no longer achieved by expanding wage labor, but rather by extending the capacity to consume to sectors that do not necessarily have what was traditionally known as inscription into the wage system. After the crisis at the beginning of the century, neoliberalism persists as and varies as a set of conditions that are manifested from above as the renewal of the extractive dispossessive form in a new moment of financialized sovereignty, and from below as a rationality that negotiates profits in this context of dispossession, in a dynamic that mixed forms of exploitation and extraction of value with new dynamics of conflicts. My hypothesis is that this form of persistence expresses the articulation between a rentier financial mediation made by progressive governments with the conditions opened up by the plebeian revolt. I wanted to think within this particular landscape. On one hand, because it remarks on the originality of this cycle of progressive governments without adopting a state-centric perspective that presumes that those governments signal the end of neoliberalism. On the other hand, because it underlines the power of the revolts, but also the problem of rethinking social transformation and popular institutions beyond the classic idea of seizing power. In this sequence, we are now in a third moment that is incorrectly called the return of neoliberalism. I say that is incorrect because the very idea of return assumes that there was a period without neoliberalism. This is the argument of the followers of populist reason, for example, just to put it very shortly. And more broadly, it depends on the idea of neoliberalism as a set of policies that can be summarized as the state versus the market. Of course, since the 2015 elections in Argentina and in Venezuela, there has been an acceleration of the dynamics that were already present in 2014 presidential elections in Brazil. The constitution of an entirely conservative business security type political bloc that tests a new articulation of the landscape configured during the period of the governments that arrived in power after intense popular revolts. Also, we have different types of crises in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Guatemala, and so on. My objective is how to understand this shift in the political landscape from this point of view. One, to avoid moralizing these electoral defeats with reasoning grounded in paternalistic progressivism. The poor don't recognize the benefits they have received, for example, or a certain corporate fatalism, lamentations that the autonomy of the politically ultimately cannot withstand with the powers that be, such as media and corporations. Two, thinking about the effects of the precarity of the apparatuses of the so-called social inclusion that they created, and especially what it means that the inclusion was created through consumption and indebtedness. Three, to explain the progressive political will as a combined process of the concentration of political decision-making in the hands of the state with a relative openness to popular forces. The so-called neo-developmentalist vocation was mixed with three enduring trends: insertion into the world market in a neo-extractivist way, micropolitics organized around neoliberal conditions of social bonds, and the financial sector's never completely reverse and particularly relaunch hegemony in the mode of accumulation. Four, we have to stress how neo-development and neoliberalism are far from being mutually exclusive or constitutive of a simple binarism. On the contrary, we have seen true zones of indiscernibility and even complementarity that end up promoting and constituting the premises for the relaunching of neoliberal reason. If one recognizes that neoliberalism and developmentalism coexist, then both the discontinuities in regard to the classically neoliberal discourses of the 90s and their readjustment based on a mixture of economic state subjective figures that once presented themselves as an alternative to the hegemony of the market and the finance become more clear. Finally, a couple of points about why feminism appears today as the more radical anti-neoliberal narrative and practice. The feminist movement in the last years has unblocked and composition from below of the conflicts that populism obstructed by blackmailing them with the idea that certain conflicts benefit the right by critiquing the government. But this is not easy. Today, the feminist movement takes charge of a conflict that explodes in bodies and in homes, in territories and workplaces. But those kind of connections is what transformed feminism in a popular anti-neoliberal feminism. It does so by producing a feminist diagnosis of that conflict based on a concrete struggles, which determines the politicity and very orientation of this political composition. Feminists is radicalized in the practice of mapping today social conflicts, layoff and Mapuche land struggles, for example, abortion and food crisis, to name just a few, and build assemblies as a mode of reactivating the democratic everyday practice of many organizations, unions, political parties, educational, cultural organizations, that produce new images of anti-neoliberal popular sovereignty in practice. These are intermittent and fragile sovereign forms, yet they are persistent and capable of producing new forms of power from below. Thank you.
What's your take on Venezuela now? How, for example, would you compare the Venezuelan situation to what happened to Allende with the right-wing astroturf movements of the Neoliberalism? What's different about the United States response now? What is it like in 2019 compared to what happened in 70 and 73? People who read about it, or at least know about it.
Empezando por ahí.
¿Por acá?
Sí.
Voy a contestar en castellano y además hay compañeros de Chile que pueden. Por supuesto, creo que las formas de golpe de Estado son muy distintas en la actualidad de lo que fueron en los años 70. Entonces, la comparación tiene que tener esas mediaciones históricas. Ahora me viene a la...
¿Quieres que te traduzca? That we would have to take into account the differences in the forms of coup, right?
Sí. Pero sin embargo me viene a la cabeza también para pensar esta superposición de temporalidades un graffiti que el movimiento feminista en Chile
That there's also comes to mind in order to think about these different temporalities, a graffiti of the feminist movement in Chile
que se hizo sobre el frente de la Universidad Católica que decía
in front of the Universidad Católica,
tiemblan los Chicago Boys, aguante el movimiento feminista.
Chicago Boys tremble, aguante,
resist
the feminist movement.
Para pensar la complicación de temporalidades en cómo trazamos la genealogía del neoliberalismo en nuestra región.
To think about the different temporalities and in order to think about how neoliberalism is expressed today.
Y por supuesto que la problemática del extractivismo y en particular lo que creo que hay que pensar como un extractivismo ampliado que no se refiere solo a los recursos naturales.
So what we would need to think about is one of the elements is extractivism, and in particular to have a more expanded notion of extractivism.
Wider extractivism, en relación a cómo el extractivismo conecta la extracción literal de recursos naturales con el extractivismo financiero a través del endeudamiento, sobre todo de sectores populares.
So we would have to think about how to link extractivism of natural resources with the extractivism of financial instruments in order to think
especialmente la explotación de los sectores populares.
Especially and specifically the exploitation of popular sectors.
Entonces creo que lo que tenemos que repensar son las formas de neoimperialismo.
So we have to really rethink forms of neo-imperialism.
Su relación con estas dinámicas de extractivismo ampliado.
Its relation to these dynamics of an expanded notion of extractivism.
¿Y qué ha pasado con esta dinámica virtuosa entre movimientos sociales y gobiernos populares?
What has happened in the dynamic between
entre movimientos sociales y gobiernos populares?
In between social movements and popular governments,
que ha preparado el terreno para este giro neofascista,
which has prepared the terrain for this to this neo-fascist turn.
De manera muy contradictoria,
in a very contradictory way,
porque también creo que hay que pensar el giro neofascista como una respuesta al movimiento feminista.
Because we also have to think about the term, neo-fascist term, as a response to the feminist movement.
I think there is room for a left critique of some of the government relationships with movements in Venezuela. I think there's room for that critique. The Bolivarian Revolution does not, is not only the government, it's the movements before, it's all those serious gains. And there has been some authoritarian tendencies that we need to critique from the left. But again, we have to respect the sovereignty of these countries, and we have to be very worried about what this kind of U.S. intervention means and the precedent that it will set if they're able to carry out these policies.
I'm not really going to add that much, because I agree with not speaking in platitudes about Venezuela, which is not my area of I have opinions, like anyone has opinions, but I don't want to do a disservice to the complexity of the situation. I will say, though, something that actually picks up from where Gianpaolo just left off, which is that Venezuela, for the hemispheric right wing, is an extremely important battle, right? It's not for no reason that when as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became popular and elected in the U.S., she's compared, Venezuela is brought up to delegitimize her, oh, you're just trying to turn the U.S. into Venezuela. So whatever we may think, and I absolutely agree with, I think, probably other panelists here, that we can certainly critique the Bolivarian Revolution on its own terms for what it did and didn't achieve. I think it's important to view this as a geopolitical struggle on the level of the hemisphere with the aim of rendering impossible the popular capture of the state in any forms. And that's their goal, and so we have to see it on those terms, which doesn't mean we don't critique the left governments that have existed or still do exist, but does mean that we see that this is a battle that's definitely beyond Venezuela. I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, but it also seems that there's no equivalent of the role that Colombia is playing now for the U.S. I think, like Gianpaolo was saying, the U.S. in '73 did not involve other Latin American countries in attempts potentially to invade or intimidate. It did it all on its own it had Brazil funding and training and things like that. But now, the implication seems to be that Colombia might invade Venezuela because of cross-border incursions or something. So it seems to be much more dangerous for all of Latin America instead of just for the single country.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for the entire panel. And I guess it goes back to, it seems like the longest standing tension between developing socialist, nationalist projects in the global south and the world problem of transnational capitalism and U.S. imperialism in the hemisphere. It seems to cut across all the presentations. My question is sort of goes back to Gianpaolo's point about the middle class. I wanted to hear more about the expatriate communities and diasporas and their role both within the expansion of the green tide, but also the restoration of capitalist class power in Argentina, in Brazil, and also in terms of the post presentation, Puerto Rico, which seems to be more complicated given the circular migrations and the fact of citizenship for Puerto Ricans. So I was hoping you all could talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
I'll say something afterwards.
Okay, I was trying to consult with the panel. I didn't want to be doing it too much. I think there's this word in Portuguese, descompasso. There's a distance, a kind of off sync between the socialist politics and this middle class in Brazil generally. And something happened that the middle class felt more positive about redistributive politics in the country up to a point, and then it tipped. I suspect, one of the things I suspect was really rubbed white middle classes the wrong way were the university policies. A lot of very ugly racist things were said in this campaign that had not been the case before, and I think it sort of touched them in a way. And then these right-wing politicians worked with that. The Brazilian diaspora is a disaster. And if there's any Brazilian diaspora watching this, you should be ashamed of yourself. Because the Brazilian diaspora voted fascist something like 98% of the votes.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of an explanation because the Brazilian migration to the U.S. in particular is very tied to these evangelical churches, and the evangelicals do a lot of work in these communities. And it's people who somehow felt out of touch with this progressive project, and they left and they found, for whatever reason, they found more opportunity here. So the diaspora is not super influential in terms of numbers, but symbolically they've been very important in this. Their vote is always counted when the first returns to come, and it's significant. It's almost 100% for this guy.
I'll just say something briefly, which is not about the Ecuadorian diaspora, though there is one. It doesn't have the same conservative character as the Brazilian diaspora, and I thought you might say something like that, not that high a figure, but and actually
that's not a scientific number.
Okay, whatever, it's fine. But I don't think it's, you don't have the same situation. The class character of Ecuadorian migrants is quite distinct from Brazilian migrants. Tend to be more middle class, and where Ecuadorians tend to migrate due to economic insecurity in Ecuador. So they're like a working class sort of. And actually, interestingly, I don't know whether it made any difference politically or not, but when Correa was in power, over the 10 years that he was in power, he attempted to reconnect with Ecuadorian migrants and create like a sort of progressive diasporic community in certain ways. And I think that there was a reform that made it easier for them to vote. And I think actually they were more Correísta, meaning more left-wing. And so a very different situation, which is kind of interesting to think about. But I'm going to say one just brief thing about middle class, not about migration or diaspora, which is that I think, another contradiction that in a longer version of this talk I would have discussed a bit in terms of the extractive model of accumulation is the way that it produces subjects that then, and this actually goes back to Veronica's talk about consumption and subjectivity. So the way that the extractive model of accumulation generates subjects with no loyalty to left politics. And so and it's tricky, because on the one hand, of course, you want to boost consumption. Like there are unmet social needs, and a demand of popular movements for decades has been basically, we need healthcare, we need education, we need nutrition. Now, there are different ways to provide those, right? So that's where it gets, I think, the limitations of the pink tide become clearer, right? So if what you do to provide them is basically do a bono, like a monthly payment, and you leave untouched the entire system of relations of production and provision of goods, but you give people more money to spend. I mean, this is going to look very similar to the post-war kind of bargain that you were talking about before. So you give people more money to spend. What does that do? First of all, their class status on a sort of identity level rises, and they sort of become disconnected from the popular struggles that allowed for that in the first place. You also, though, and this is where it gets even more the cunning of sort of neoliberalism, is you also give more money to the private sector, because where's that consumption happening but in private pharmacies, private hospitals, private supermarket chains? And what happened in Ecuador, and I believe the patterns are very similar in Bolivia, I can't speak to all the other cases, I think Venezuela is also similar in this respect, probably Argentina too, is that you actually, in terms of domestic markets, domestic consumer markets, you have a economic concentration that happens. The 5 families that own all the pharmacy, own even more that sort of thing. That concentration happens, which, what does that do but create the economic conditions for the return of the right? As soon as the commodity boom is over and the money's not being filtered through the state to the private sector has no loyalty to the left governments that actually helped them economically. So you have middle class or sort of precariously middle class people that lose their identity with the popular sectors as they rise in income or, sort of in consumption capacity. And then you have a re-empowered private sector that benefited from the state, but that's always invisibilized, like the way they benefit from the state, right? And so you have the sort of political and economic conditions for a reopening of the right. So I think the middle class, and it's understudied or underanalyzed a bit, at least in sort of U.S. social science, I think, looking at the downfall of the pink tide, is a really key point of inflection in class composition that then changes the political terrain.
That same dynamic was present in the Allende government in the first 3 months. There was a big debate as to which direction to go, to increase consumption and use a kind of Keynesian pump priming, or to reform the legislature from bicameral to unicameral so it essentially reflects more the democratic composition of the country and give the people from below more power. They went with increasing consumption, and the Senate then remained the center of reaction, which was used against them later. It's hard to get people to do structural reforms as opposed to increasing consumption. But you know, it's going to come back again. I think that reads with your readings very well. Steve,
yeah, thanks a lot for everybody's great discussion. The criticisms of the pink tide were laid out very well taken. I just want to ask you, how much of that are problems in policy in states, and how much of it, as I believe, is the idea that they were actually trying to take over and manage capitalism rather than abolish it. Rather than abolishing the state and creating an actual grassroots state from the bottom up that would actually begin to eliminate capitalism, the traditional Marxist approach. It was attempting to manage it and therefore led to these other problems, hopefully being lost.
There we are. I'm gonna just repeat myself a little bit from something I said before, but maybe elaborate it a little bit. I think that on so many levels, there was not a confrontation with capital. And I don't even know that I'm saying that in a completely critical way, because I think it's difficult to confront where do you begin with that? It's extremely entrenched system, and it has its neo-colonial characteristics that make it even harder in some ways to confront. But even if we go way more on the reform side than the revolution side, even if we put aside a sort of state-led revolution or kind of what you were suggesting, just on the issue of collecting taxes from wealthy people, that is something that there were some strides made in some states, and Ecuador actually did a little bit more of this than it had in the past. But for basically since independence, the Latin American countries, the ruling class of Latin American countries has refused to pay taxes. We think there's an anti-tax culture in the U.S. There's a really deep anti-tax culture among Latin American elites, and now it's gotten even more sophisticated because they can put their money in offshore financial havens and things like that. So it's really difficult, again, way short of revolution, but just shifting the fiscal basis of the state from resource rents to actually taxing property was something that governments were maybe want to do in theory, but did not do in practice, and the commodity boom kind of saved them from having to do it at all. And so that's just one example of where you see, and one other, where you see kind of a lack of confrontation with the ruling class, which again, short of revolution, but still taxation seems like socialism to Latin American elites. So they would have responded on in a very reactionary way to that, but it would have been interesting, to see what would have happened. The other thing that didn't really happen, with some exceptions, was nationalization or expropriation. And there's a total lie in the U.S. and Latin American media that countries like Venezuela or Bolivia nationalized their economy. This did not happen. This did not happen, right? There were certain companies or certain contracts that were renegotiated. There were partial divestments or forced buyouts, but really the private sector remained in size or grew, as I was suggesting before, under left-wing governments, right? And so you have, the fiscal policy stuff, and then in terms of ownership, there really wasn't a transition to socialism at the level of state policy. However, there was some interesting things, and we could debate it, and not to go back to the Venezuela debate too much, but there were in some cases interesting experiments with communal and cooperative ownership at local levels and communes and things like that, and some of those were state supported, but they were not enough to sort of in any way displace the private sector, which actually I think, if my facts are correct, grew in size under the pink tide, so kind of in the opposite direction of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things to it. When the Workers' Party arrived in Brasilia in 2003, it was very much a kind of it was in play what it was going to be, and there were different ministries and different proposals. So, one of the key policies was this conditional cash transfer. What people don't talk about today was that there was a more progressive idea for conditional cash transfer that was linked to the empowerment of communities in this sort of Allende vision of taking control of the government and building a political culture. And that was abandoned in favor of one that basically bothered no one. There's a tiny bit of the GNP and got consumers into the market and sold refrigerators. And then, there's this interesting debate in Brazil too. People call it the class C, this emerging lower middle class that emerged out of these processes and turned out not to be loyal to the Workers' Party. One of the roads not taken was capital controls, right? Argentina has had capital controls. Brazil, there was a very serious discussion about introducing some of those. But for whatever play of forces, when they arrived in Brazil, there was a sense, look, no, we got to hold on. We got to invest in the institutions. We got to redistribute. Next time we'll do it. And basically what happened was, okay, this logic of we got to hold on. An interesting chronicle, if you want to see a take on this, is look at the pronouncement of the landless movement about the Workers' Party governments over time. And it became a kind of like critical support, meaning we'll go to the streets to prevent fascism, and it's a friendlier government than the alternative, but this is not what we had been expecting.
I think that maybe the problem is to think about loyalty in terms of ideological loyalty. When the policies are just thinking about pragmatical habits of the popular sectors and the so-called middle class.
Right.
So I think it's a different perspective on how to think, because if you think about loyalty, you have to think about ratio. So I think that we have to think the electoral defeat in different terms. Yeah. And the other thing is how this, for example, those conditional cash transference were imposed and conditioned itself by social movements and not as an idea of an autonomous policy from above. I think that we have to rethink also this kind of interaction between social policies and government in terms of how those social forces can conquest different spaces, and at the same time how this inclusion is made by financial devices. So I think this is the key point to rethink what is this kind of not ideological state of the defeat.
Well taken.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you for coming out.